everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about that marvel of textile architecture called corset. Now, corsets were a regular part of Western women's fashion throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, and they changed dramatically through that more than 100 years of their existence. And not only is this done through the actual shape of the corset, but through all of the more technical aspects as well, looking at the patterning, the structure, the fabrics that make it up, even some of the technological achievements. So corsets are not a single stagnant Victorian corset. They are a dramatically changing garment that is an integral part of women's fashion. In fact, corsets serve far more purpose than just an aesthetic one. Yes, they can serve to modify the shape of the body, whether it is by pulling the waist in or padding out the hips and the bust, but they also serve a great deal of more functional purposes as well. They were there for back support, especially for women who were doing labor or working around the house, dealing with children, picking up things all the time. They also served as bust support, as what we commonly think of as the bra was not really around yet. Yes, there were bust improvers and other sorts of bust support throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, but they really relied on the corset to do most of the heavy lifting, as it were. They also served the purpose of managing to support the weight of the garments that the women were wearing. If you look at many of the different styles throughout the 19th century, they're full of yards and yards of fabric, and tying that tightly about your bare waist is incredibly painful by the end of the day. So there needed to be something to support and help spread out that weight along the body. So corsets were really the interaction between a woman's body and her garments, making sure that they functioned well together and that the fashionable shape was achieved, but also that a woman could function and do what she needed to do on a daily basis while still being comfortable. And I know that this concept of function as well as fashion can go against some of our old stereotypes of historical corsets, but honestly, that is another video for another day because there is so much to unpack there. In fact, the concept of the stereotypes around corsets, and more specifically around tight lacing, is something that you can find all over the 19th century and continues to this day, not just as an effect on what we think of as the corset, but what we think of as fashion and the gendering of fashion, or women's minds and how they deal with the world around them. In fact, the entire concept around fashion being a feminine thing and including a great deal of vanity along with it is a very 19th century concept, and it ties in greatly to the corset as its prime example. And it was used consistently as an example of why women were just too simple to be able to actually control themselves, and, well, they needed men to guide them through life so they didn't literally hurt themselves out of vanity. But as I said, that is a whole big story for another day, so today we're really going to be digging into those different styles, those different technological achievements, and understanding how that structure and the proportions of the corset actually change throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, because it really is all about those proportions and that ideal figure. So while there are ideal body shapes for every era and therefore for every corset, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do any other time periods. In fact, my body shape is really not ideal for any corsets. I have what we consider a more modern body shape, simply meaning that it's more athletic. I am not squishy. I have a fair bit of muscle in my abdomen, so it doesn't squish down. I also am very short-waisted. I am all leg. So that means that my lowest rib ends here and my hip bone is there. So there is no space between the two, meaning that I have very little room to actually pull in my waist. So I'm not going to ever get a lot of reduction, no matter what style I'm in. So we're going to start by measuring my body, because we need to know what my baseline is in order to understand what these corsets are actually doing to me. Starting with the hip, at its fullest point, I am 39.5 inches or 100 centimeters. At the waist, I am just under 30 inches or 76 centimeters. At the underbust, because this is important for the factor that this is where you breathe from. So this is why everyone thinks corsets make it so you can't breathe. They assume it constricts here. So we're going to take two measurements here. One is resting, and that is 31.5 or 80 centimeters. And then we're going to breathe out as far out this way as I can. I'm going to try to not breathe up, but years of vocal coaching have taught me to breathe this way, not this way. And that gets us up to 33 inches or 84 centimeters. So that is as far as my lungs can expand. And then my bust at its fullest point is 38 inches or 97 centimeters. So we'll keep those measurements in mind, and I'll post them again so that way we can reference them as we see how my body shape and size changes with corsets. Our first garment is actually not technically a corset. It is what we call a transitional pair of stays, meaning that it is the in-between of the 18th century pair of stays, which has a conical, rigid shape, and the 19th century corset, which usually has more of a natural hourglass shape. So this is how they transition between the two, simply cutting cups for the bust into that conical shape. It has a very high waistline because the waistline of gowns at this time is rising to the underbust, so your actual waistline is not terribly relevant. It has very lightweight structure, meaning that there is some boning placed around the body in order to keep the garment from actually collapsing as you move, but it is not heavily structured. It is also very lightweight fabric. It has a layer of linen buckram on the interior, and then the exterior is made up of a lightweight cotton twill. All in all, it is a very lightweight and unstructured bodice. The bust itself is only supported by one layer of fabric that has some drawstrings running through it in order to provide the appropriate size and support. It laces up the back using a spiral lacing design rather than a crisscross lacing design. In front we do have a decorative lace, however it's not an actually functional piece of the garment. It can be let in or out, but it can't be completely undone. For measurements, there's really not much point in me measuring my hip or my waist because it's nowhere near either one of those things, but we will go ahead and take a look at the underbust and the bust to see how that area is affected. The underbust comes out at 32 inches or 81 centimeters, slightly larger than my natural, which makes sense since there is some added bulk. And the bust comes out at 39 inches or 99 centimeters. So we have neither reduced or added to the bust measurement at this point. Our first true corset comes from around 1810. This style is very long line, meaning that it goes up to mid-bust and goes down to almost the hip. It has a very smooth, natural curve to its shape, meaning that there is no major reduction or any padding out. It also has almost no structure to it. The only major structure is from a removable wooden busk in the front and a couple of bones down the back that prevent the corset from collapsing when it is laced. The entire body of the corset is only structured by way of cording and stitching the layers together. The layers are only a very thin layer of linen and a cotton twill, so there is very little actual bulk or structure to this corset. The bust is given space by way of a few gussets, but doesn't have any major shaping. It's mostly just lift and support. This corset will make sure that you have good posture, but the actual shape of the body underneath is not terribly relevant, as gowns in this era have a waistline just below the bust, so the waist and the hips won't be seen at all in these fashions. Therefore, it is not important to make any major adjustments to the body in order to get the fashionable shape. The goal is just to get the bust in the correct place and make sure that you are standing properly. The hip measurement on this particular corset will be just below the actual corset. So we are still at 39.5 or about 100 centimeters. The waist is 30 inches or 76 centimeters. The underbust, 32 inches or 81 centimeters, so a little bit bigger than my actual size, which is expected because of the bulk. And the bust is 37 inches or 94 centimeters, though I should specify that this corset is a very old one for me and no longer fits me properly. So if I made it again, I would certainly allow for more space in the bust. Next, we have the 1830s. There's not a terrible lot of difference visually from the 18 teens corset to the 1830s. However, there are some changes in its overall shape and style. This corset does cover the same vertical space that the previous one did. The major changes, though, come in the fact that it has gussets not only for the bust, but also for the hip space. Clothing at this time has started to drop its waist down to the natural waist, meaning that though the hips are still not seen, the waist is. So there is an interest in having a slight bit more of a curve to the figure. Now there's not a drastic amount of change by any means at this time. There's a slight bit more structure in this corset as well, in addition to the busk at the front, which is now slightly curved to accommodate the belly of the figure rather than being completely straight like it was 20 years earlier. The back still has boning, but there is also a little bit of boning at the side back and the side front in order to help keep the corset from wrinkling up as you move. This is more important now since the body does show even when the gown is on, versus earlier years where if it wrinkled up a little bit, you wouldn't have seen it. A lot of the structure is still due to cording and stitching of the layers together. In this case, the layers are simply a very thin layer of linen and a cotton sateen. The back is still laced using stitched eyelets, so we're still not at the point where we can actually pull very easily on the laces in order to do any reduction. However, this is the time period where tuberculosis is a major issue, so there were a lot of concerns over constricting the lungs at all, meaning that though corsets were not terribly maligned in this era, tight lacing was. The hips, still just below the corset, come in at 39.5 or 100 centimeters, so at my natural. My waist is 30.5 or 77 centimeters. So it's actually gotten a little bit bigger, which makes sense because I have a very large wooden busk right there. My underbust comes in at 33 inches or 84 centimeters, so that has grown significantly. And my bust, in a better fitting corset, comes in at 38.5 or 98 centimeters. So it hasn't really changed much. It is definitely sitting in a different place than it does naturally, but there is no major adjustment to any part of my body in this corset. By the 1860s, we start to see a more dramatic change in our style of corsets. Not only has the shape shifted slightly to more accentuate a narrow waist, but there is a great deal more infrastructure in these styles. The hip has shortened and the bust has lowered ever so slightly from our earlier styles. We are still using gussets in order to get the proper shape for the bust and the shape over the hips as well. So we haven't fully moved on from that particular method just yet. However, you will see that there is a great deal more structure in this style of corset. There's a lot more boning around the entire torso, and there is a separating metal busk in the front. This is a very important and dramatic change for corsets going forward. This means that the corset doesn't have to be unlaced and relaced every time. It makes it very simple for someone to get themselves in and out of the corset, which greatly affects the ease in which corsets can be worn. You'll also notice that there are metal grommets in the back at this point in time, meaning that it is a little bit easier to lace up, specifically if you want to pull the corset a little bit tighter. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are encouraging tight lacing. That is still a major concern of this era. However, since fashions at this time do fit to the body very snugly, you can see the structure of the body underneath, and you want it to be very smooth. You still can't see the hips, however, so the focus is still on the torso. Garments of this era do not try to overemphasize a tiny waist by bringing it in tightly with your corset. Instead, women are fashionably wearing cage crinolines of over 100 inches in circumference, and frankly, anyone would look tiny with a skirt that large. The actual structural layers of this garment are made up of a cotton sateen as well as a silk satin for the exterior layer. The boning channels, since they do run over the seams, are done up in a separate layer of cotton, and the bones are held into place by this flossing, the extra decorative stitching that you see around the corset. Once again, my natural hip is well below the actual corset length, simply because you cannot see that in those fashions. But my full hip is at 39.5 or 100 inches, and my waist is now at 29 inches or 74 centimeters, so it is slightly reduced, likely a little bit more than that 29 inches because there is boning and extra structure added back in, but it is not anything drastic. The underbust we have at 33.5 or 85 centimeters, so that has increased greatly, which is not surprising considering that I can fit my entire hand in that front. And the bust is actually at 40 inches or 102 centimeters. Moving into the late 1880s, we can really see the sort of very curvy hourglass corset that we typically think of as the standard Victorian corset. Now, this is the one that does have by far the most extreme ratio in terms of shape. Fashions of this era are somewhat fitted over the hips and flat in the front, so the entire torso down to the hips is more visible underneath the actual clothing at the time. That being said, these are still fairly lightweight garments. This particular corset has a single layer of cotton for structure, an exterior layer of silk satin, and then the boning channels are actually done externally with another layer of the cotton and silk satin. There is some flossing to keep the boning in place. There should be more, but I haven't finished it yet. The bones do not necessarily follow the seams of the corset, hence why they do have separate boning channels. The corset curves are created by way of curving vertical seams as well as continuing to use some gussets. There is a fair bit of boning structure around the body, but there are still many areas that are left open and unstructured. In fact, some of those areas in this particular style have cording in them, much like corsets of the very early part of the 19th century. The separating metal busk is still there in the front, however, this era tends to use what is called a spoon busk, meaning that it widens and curves down at the very bottom. It also bows out ever so slightly and curves around the belly. So there is an expectation that women will not have a completely flat front during this era, and fashions of the time will sometimes even accentuate that belly. The bust is also incredibly low on this particular style. You can see that though my waist is here, the bust extends very quickly from the waist, which means that my actual bust does not fill that space at all. So while the waist is very snug, there is ample room around the ribcage. The same is true for the hips as well. While the corset does end well above the full part of the hips, which I am still measuring at 39.5 or 100 centimeters, there is a lot of space for a belly here. I personally do not fill this out, and actually reduced it from the original pattern. The waist in this corset tends to be the smallest one that I can achieve, and we have about 28 inches or 71 centimeters. So that's a reduction of only about 2 inches, though I will admit it looks dramatically smaller. For the underbust, it's actually something I tend to have trouble measuring in this particular style, since where the underbust of the corset is and where mine is are very different. But it's coming out at about 36 inches or 91 centimeters. So yeah, that's a pretty dramatic difference. The actual bust, which sits right at the very top of the corset, measures at 40 inches or about 102 centimeters. So in this particular style of corset, it definitely starts to be all about illusion and proportions. If you bring the bust and the hip together towards the waist, the difference will seem much more severe than if it was done over a much taller span. So, not surprisingly, lots of illusion here. The 1900s corset is what we call an S-bent corset. a great deal of the emphasis is placed on the lower half of the body. So what you end up with is what they consider an S shape, meaning that the bust is full in the front and the lower portion of the body is very full in back. So it appears that there is a sway to the back of the person. In reality, it's a lot of padding both under and over the corset to achieve this silhouette. This is why this is the only corset that you will see me wearing a hip pad underneath. In order to get the correct proportions, there is no way that I can get my waist down that small, so instead I pad out the hip. This is why the corsets are so incredibly long. Fashions of this era cling to the hips and fall away from that widest point, so you can see all of those curves. Therefore, the corset needs to be long enough that you don't end up with the historical equivalent of panty lines. The bust, however, is fairly low, in part because of where the fashionable bust needs to sit, but also you're going to be covering up all of this with layers of ruffles and gathers and things to fill it out. So where the bust sits certainly does not need to be held far up in this particular era. This is also a time where you start to see very complex seaming on corsets. The bones will not follow these seams for obvious reasons. Instead, will be placed around the body in separate boning channels. Just like our previous corsets, we have a single layer of thin cotton, and then we have a layer of a silk satin on top, and the boning channels on the inside are done in another layer of that cotton. We still have the long metal busk. It has returned to a straight busk, so we no longer have that protruding curve out of the front that the spoon busk gave us. So for hip measurements, this will probably be the first time that we see that actual hip measurement drastically change, because we are only just at that bottom part of the corset with all of the padding. So pulled tightly, we're looking at 42 inches or close to 107 centimeters, which is a fairly dramatic change from my actual hip measurement. We've gone up almost 3 inches. My waist measurement now is at 28.5 or just above 72 centimeters. So while I have reduced about 1.5 inches, the difference of going up 2.5 inches in my hips and going down 1.5 inches in my waist adds up to a 4-inch difference, which is pretty dramatic in its appearance. For the underbust, it's going to be a little bit difficult to measure just because it is the actual underbust point of the corset sits much lower than my real underbust, but comes out to about 35 inches or 89 centimeters, so much larger than my actual bust, no different than the previous 1880s corset. There is a lot of space here. There is some reduction right here, but it ends very quickly. For the bust measurement, we're looking at 39 inches or 99 centimeters, so it really hasn't made a massive adjustment to my bust. In fact, my bust is sitting very naturally where it would without a corset. It is barely covered by the top edge of this corset at all. The bust is still sitting incredibly low. Our final corset is also a bit of a transitional piece. Corsets from the 19-teens are moving from the ancestry of curvy corsets into the girdle of the 20th century, which is more a focus on smoothing out the figure and controlling the lower half of the body. You can really see the difference in the fact that this does not have an over-accentuated figure. The hips are not larger than my actual hips. It is very lightweight and very smoothing, but it doesn't even support the bust. So it really is a transition piece between that corset and that girdle, which would then later become control top pantyhose and Spanx and diet and exercise. So we've always had something to control and smooth this part of our body, but this particular style of corset does really nothing to reduce the figure. In fact, the hip to waist ratio of this garment is very minimal, and the pattern is actually taken directly off of an original garment which was sold as a mass-produced corset in a standard size, so it was not adjusted to fit my measurements. As you can see, the bust line has dropped below the bust at this point, offering no support there, hence why we start seeing more and more chest support options, whether it is brassieres, bust improvers, bandeaus, or all sorts of different options during this time period. The bottom has dropped well below my hips, though there is no actual structure below my hip line, so I still have a full range of movement and can sit down. The boning is very sparse, only found in 2 parts on the sides and in the very center back. The front does still have that easy opening metal busk, and that really helps to make sure that the body stays nice and flat and straight in the center front. The back is cross-laced with metal grommets just like before, so that way it is easy to make adjustments or pull it tighter if you need to. But again, this corset is so lightweight, it is a single layer of cotton, that it really clearly is not meant for any sort of tight lacing. It is as lightweight and as unstructured as possible, meaning that in reality, it doesn't change my figure at all. It just means that I have to stand upright, otherwise it's very uncomfortable. For the measurements, I don't expect this to make a really big difference since it is so lightweight and unstructured. For the hips, we're looking at 40 inches or 101 centimeters, so it is slightly larger than my actual hip measurement, which may just be due to the bulk of the actual corset. My waist is just over 30 inches, or actually closer to 77 centimeters. So again, I have added just slightly to my natural waist. I can feel that there is some pressure being put on that area, but it is very minimal. And then my underbust, which comes out to 32 inches or 81 centimeters, so slightly larger than my regular size. Now, lest you be concerned that women in the 1900s had corsets that clearly did not allow them to move and function and have physical activity, there were other styles available throughout all of these decades. There were corsets specific to athletic activities or maternity or different ages. So there are very different shapes, different constructions, different fabrics, different cuts altogether. That meant that they functioned for different activities. Not everyone wore the exact same style of corset, no different than today we have sports bras, or underwire bras, or strapless bras, or bralettes, or front closure bras, or wireless, or overwire, or balconette, or scoop, or could just keep going on and on and on the list. Depending on what activity you need and what your body needs, you're going to be wearing a different corset. And this is a great example of this. This is a ribbon corset, and this style dates to around the beginning of the 20th century. It is a very easy and comfortable corset to wear. It doesn't have very much structure. It has the busk in front to get in and out easily. It has some boning on the sides and a little bit in back to keep the corset from collapsing, but that is it. It's very short and it's underbust, so it really doesn't restrict your movement at all. It is simply a great way to support your back and to support the weight of skirts. Now obviously, because this is such a short corset, it won't really affect the hip or the bust. It honestly won't affect the underbust as either, because that is actually above really where the corset pulls in. It should just affect the waist. And I have a measurement of just over 28 inches or 72 centimeters, which the reason why I can lace down to this as snugly as I can is because it doesn't have any constriction over my ribs or over my hips at all. So it makes it very smooth and simple to get a more narrow waist with this, even though it honestly doesn't feel nearly as snug as the 28 inches in my 1880s corset. So I really did not, I have to admit, I really didn't expect that measurement because it's so comfy. I'm as bewildered as you are. All right, for experimental purposes, yes. I can totally